Thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to welcome Professor Romain Brethes as a guest speaker at a seminar entitled Eros, Amor, the Erotic Culture of the Early Global World, a seminar that takes place at UCLA under the twice felicitous auspices of the Department of Classics and of the CMRS Center for Early Global Studies. I'm deeply grateful to the chair of classics, Alice Purvis, who is here, can wave to us, and to the director of CMRS-CEGS, Professor Drinka Stauliak, for offering me this marvelous opportunity. It is an honor, and thank you both, Alex and Drinka, very, very much. To open today's special event, the lecture by Romain Brethes, a two-way road, Comparative Anthropology of Eros and Sensuality in Latin, Elegy, and the Greek novel, whom I will introduce in a moment. I would like to say a few words about the seminar itself. Well, in all societies, the erotic experience is, to say the least, complex. It is shaped by norms, habits, emotions, sensations, and manners of living the body. Such an experience is a matter of concern, inquiry, ritualizations, and representations across a variety of discourses, most of them normative, some of them performative, of domains of knowledge and of aesthetic creativity. In the seminar that frames today's guest lecture, we have taken a resolute stand. We look at this phenomenon, the erotic, as a matter of desire, pleasure, bodies, institutions. By focusing on these aspects of the erotic experience as precisely an experience, we go far beyond a pragmatic of the sexual acts, beyond the controversial notion of sexuality, beyond sex as power, and above all, beyond the tiresome dogma of a pre-modern, pre-packaged, fetishized before an allegedly Christian interpretive approach to what is felt, before the allegedly recent emergence of an idiosyncratic amorous lifestyles and of deeply ingrained erotic inclinations. But we are not fascinated by the quest of a permanent already either. Quite the opposite. We bring to the fore what was truly relevant in the erotic cultures of the ancient world, sensuality. This is something I've started to think about and argue for in an embarrassingly old book, Sex and Sensuality in the Ancient World, published in English in 2008. I still think today, and more than ever, that sensuality is the right way to go. Why? Well, because in ancient societies, sensuality is far more important than sex. But what is sensuality? To be sensual or sensuous means to pursue the pleasure of the senses. Now, among the senses, there is touch, and touch is the essence of sex as the congress of bodies. Think of Aristotle. Sensuality includes contact of the skin and the flesh, of course, but also the pleasures of all the other sense organs. A capacious attitude that encompasses all kinds of perceptions. Sensuality is the overarching erotic experience. While it may well include coition, which is merely a kind of haptic interaction among others, erotic and amorous encounters cannot be reduced to the execution of one particular sexual act. Such encounters are sensual. Sensuality involves caresses, embraces, kisses, gazes, and any other wishful, mnemonic, or imaginary aesthetic approach to another person. It is about actual sensations and about their possibilities. It vastly exceeds, therefore, the mechanics of penetration, an act that, although overinterpreted and overrated in contemporary scholarship, is seldom mentioned in ancient literary sources, and for a very good reason. Except in medical contexts, in comedy, and in otherwise chastising genres of discourse, genital or anal penetration was irrelevant. Sensuality, on the contrary, captures the actual concerns of ancient thinkers and writers about Eros and Amor. So far from opposing love and sex, Homeric characters, Sappho and her Greek and Roman successors, Plato and Ovid, and the novelist understand the erotic amorous life inseparably from a quest for the pleasure of all the senses and from either a sorrowful, hyperrealistic phenomenology of its failure or from a confident art of taking pleasure. In this framework, I'm delighted to welcome a colleague, a friend, and a fellow traveler on the road to sensuality. Romain Brethes teaches political humanities at Sciences Po in Paris and is a professor in a very special kind of academic institution in France, les classes préparatoires aux grandes écoles, and in this particular case, one of the very best, Janson de Sailly in Paris. Romain Brethes is a member of the Center Anima, Anthropology and History of the Ancient World, formerly the Centre Louis Gernet. He is the author of a book, De l'idéalisme au réalisme, une étude du comique dans le roman grec, so a reading of Greek novel from the point of view of comedy and of laughter, published in 2007. Another book, Celebrity, Riche, Célèbre et Antique, that came out in 2010. And he is the co-editor of a new translation of Greek and Latin novels for Les Belles Lettres, roman grec et latin that was published in 2016. It was a monumental work of comment and translation of the corpus of the novel. But let me add a couple of articles among many that Professor Brethes has been publishing over the years. In 2012, How to Be a Man Towards a Sexual Definition of the Self in Achilles Statius' novel Leucippe and Clitophon, for the catastrophic multilingualism here. This was published in a collective volume edited by Futre Pinheiro, Skinner and Seidlin, narrating desire, Eros, sex and gender in the ancient novel. And let me quote another English piece of 2007, Who Knows What? The Access to Knowledge in Greek and Roman Novels, again in a collective book, Frangoulidis and Pascalis, the Greek and the Roman novel, Parallel Readings, Ancient Narrative. Professor Brethes is currently working on the reception of Latin elegy in the Greek novel, also a very exciting shared interest of research between the two of us, and also on a forthcoming book about the new issues concerning polytheism in ancient Greece. Please join me in welcoming Professor Romain Brethes, who will talk about a two-way road, comparative anthropology of Eros and sensuality in Latin elegy and the Greek novel.
Thank you for your invitation and thank you for the presentation. I feel it in my fingers, I feel it in my toes. Love is all around me and so the feeling grows. So if you really love me, come on and let it show. This is a song, an original song by the Trogs in 1967. And just like in this song, this original song, in Greek and Latin sources, the very effects of love are visible, experienced, and engraved in the body. Whether it be the eyes, the skin, the stomach, through a furtive gaze or some blushing cheeks, and even sometimes in the bones or in the ears. At the beginning of his Amores, Ovid expresses some vivid symptoms of this osseous pain endured by the lover. What shall I say this means? That my coach seems so hard, and the coverlets will not stay in place, and I pass a long, long night untouched by sleep. And the weary bones of my tossing body are filled with ache. For I should know, I think, were I in any wise assailed by love. Or can it be that love is stolen to me and cunningly works my arm with covered heart? Thus it must be. So the poet claims that he for sure would recognize love if he were under his influence. I should have known if it was love. He has to admit that thanks to a tecta ars, a covered heart, Amor uses artifices and tricks that could deceive someone who is not an expert in erotic business. You need to be a doctus to recognize and dominate Eros. And Ovid will have to shape a new poetic persona in the art of love to give his lessons. In Achilles Statius' Greek novel, L'Occupé and Clitophon, generally dated from the middle of the 2nd century CE, we surprisingly learn that we can fall in love not at first sight, but at first hearing. A young and unrestrained young man from Byzantium, the prodigal and extravagant Callisthenes, has heard about the beauty of L'Occupé and has fallen in love with her without even seeing her. His love was based, or his desire was based on hearsay, ex acoes erastes. The wantonness of the licentious is so great that even with their ears, they wallow on in erotic pleasure, and they suffer through mere words the effects that wounded eyes usually administer to the soul. Bones, ears, all the organs and senses, even the less expected ones, are troubled by the power of love. As I have suggested in the presentation of this lecture, the issue of cultural dynamics and transfer from Rome to Greece is now becoming a hotspot in the field of classical studies. For a certain time, those who assumed that Greek authors from the imperial era might have known, read, and quoted, in the wider sense of quotation, Roman texts were almost considered as apostates of the Greek cause. The doxa was stated in 1997 by Bruno Rochette, a Belgian linguist and specialist of the influence and presence of Roman language in the imperial Greece. And here is a translation from the French text. You've got the text on the handout. Greeks were not at all interested in Roman culture and literature, and even the most favorable to Rome among Greek authors deliberately ignore Latin language and literature. Stephen Tilg noticed in his monograph on Appius Metamorphoses that the reception of Latin literature in the Greek world is a tricky issue. The rule, and I quote Tilg again, is that Greek writers normally did not use Latin models. We must acknowledge that Giulia was part of this avant-garde movement in her much inspiring book, Sexe et Sensualité, la culture érotique des anciens, the French version of Sex and Sensuality in the Ancient World. As a matter of fact, she suggested that the authors of ancient Greek novels might have been aware of Roman poetry, and in particular the Ars Amatoria, though it was not commonly taken into consideration among scholars of the novelistic genre. Dan Jolovitz, whose recently published book, Latin Poetry in the Greek Novels, might be a game changer in the field, is nonetheless right when he says that it is still a controversial proposition, and much is at stake regarding how it bears on our modeling of Greco-Roman relations at the literary, cultural, and socio-political levels. If it is well known that Greece was open to models from Egypt, Near East, and Asia Minor that have fashioned an unstable and porous identity, this cultural openness should make us question whether Rome and its literature is as shut out from imperial culture as has been generally assumed. In other words, the one-way road, or if I may say so, the highway that leads from Greece to Rome and that scholars used to proceed on for decades, might now be turning into a two-way road with Latin linguistic, cultural, and anthropological clues disseminating throughout Greek textual sources. This new way will not necessarily be a highway with multiple tracks as the ones you've got in Los Angeles, but would rather look like a road path with bumps or potholes, hard to explore with a traditional car. Furthermore, one of the most exciting paths to follow may be the one taking us from the fascinating manifestations of Amor in Ovid's love treatises to the kaleidoscopic signs of Eros, which parade down the Greek novels. Both in Ovidian Elegy and Greek novels, the erotic experience takes shape at the crossroads of sophistical knowledge and unfortunate ignorance, witty play and more or less successful strategies, sensual activity, and semiotics paradise. As Giulia sums up in her recent paper about the comparative sensuality at work in Ovid and Longus, the art offers a meditation about love as a multidimensional experience that encompasses a variety of aspects: corporeal, emotional, aesthetic, moral, cultural, social, and cognitive. Such a definition would perfectly fit the novelistic agenda, mainly the ones of Achillostatius and Longus. Both novelists were presumed members of the so-called Second Sophistic Club, an informal and select movement that has mostly flourished during the 1st century CE. While Longus attributes to his own protagonists a mix of instinctual ineptitude, sensorial dumbness, and experimental skepticism, Achillostatius exhibits through his two characters. The Erotic Elegy and the Greek novel both display an interest in questioning a gender symmetry between the lover and their beloved throughout the process that unfolds from their first meeting to the crucial moment, as it is celebrated euphemistically and ambiguously by French painters from the 18th century like Jean-Honoré Fragonard and his famous painting L'écrou, the bolt, which is on the screen. As Romain Zeitling reminds, Longus and Achillostatius promote the mysteries of Eros and are indebted to Platonic treatises, notably the Symposium and the Phaedrus, for play as for profit. This is perfectly right. However, I wonder if the impressive Platonic shadow has not excessively veiled the perceptions and discourses about erotic energies at work in these two novels. This Greek endogenous approach is now, if not contested, since the Platonic background cannot be denied in the novels, extended by the unexpected irruption of an Ovidian touch, which sets up a new frame in the Eros novelistic system. I come now to my first point. Let us have a glance into a privileged moment of sensual triangulation that occurs more than once in Ovid. This triangulation mixes up the viewing, the touching, and the tasting, and especially blossoms when the sun goes down during a time devoted to autumn, leisure, and lusus, play. The convivium or dinner party plays an important part in the symbolic of Roman pleasures of conviviality and reflects the spirit of urban sophistication and relaxation. Play, lusus, has a language of its own, through which one sense erouses another, just as one pleasure leads to another. Wordplay, roleplay, and erotic play are inseparable and essential for a successful convivium. In Ovid, this social parenthesis celebrates the fluidity of erotic exchanges, benefited by the smoothness and power of wine. The wine itself is resourceful in the art of love because it is firstly used to subverbal communications, as we'll see, where the senses of viewing, touching, and tasting can interact. In the labyrinths of semiotics, visible during the convivium, every sign needs to be scanned and deciphered at the expense of the official wir. In the elegiac word, wir refers not specifically to the husband, but rather to the official partner of the puella, whose social status is deliberately blurred by the poet. And this is the text 1 on the screen and on your handout. Keep your eyes on me to get my notes and the language of my eyes, and catch my stealthy signs and yourself return them. With my brows, I shall say to you words that speak without sound. In this situation, the poet is the one who tries to catch the puella's attention by using a secret language, while the official wir lies down next to her lady, unaware of what is happening under his eyes. But the poet can also perform the role of the cheated wir. In that case, the language of Abrams betrays the unfaithfulness of the beloved, while the poet decifies the duplicity of the puella because in your note was much of speech. We find a comparable advice in the Ars Amatoria when the poet sustains that there are often voice and words in a silent look. This silent dialogue takes almost an organic shape thanks to the fingers of the two lovers who draw letters in the wine on the table to communicate secretly. And this is a text 3. You will read words from my fingers. You will read words traced in wine. Once again, the puella can use the same trick, the silent look, the drawing in wine, to address the poet's rival, a device that the poet considers as outrageous, precisely because he's not a rookie you can play at the expense of, as this is a text 4. I saw you both say many things with quivering of the brow. In your notes was much of speech. Your eyes too, girl, the table was written over with wine, nor did any letter fail your fingers. The poet recommends the same trick to his pupil in the Ars Amatoria, the text 5. You may trace light flatteries in seeing character of wine, that on the table she may read herself your mistress. Afterwards, in the third and last movement of this erotic pocket symphony, it is the turn of the lips to appear on the stage. While drinking on the same side of the cup where a beloved had drunk before, the lover transforms the drinking in kissing with a tacit and hidden approbation of the puella. See that you are the first to size the cup her lips, labialis, have touched, and drink at that part where she has drank. As the wine spreads its softness and vital breath into the mouth and the body of the drinker, the symbolic kiss disseminates the same kind of benevolent energy into the two lovers. The breath in the kiss has the same burning quality as wine. It is a quintessence of the blood that carries it through every part of the body. And this vital breath is all the more active when a man or woman is inflamed with wine and love. This game blends erotic and subverbal tricks, and the poet first learns how to master these artifices for himself in the Amores, before teaching to his imaginary student in the Ars Amatoria how to use and decipher them, partly as a way to make sure that the puella positively responds to the stimuli he is appealing to. A very comparable scene occurs in Achilles novel. If Ovid himself was, according to Hermann Frankl, a poet between two worlds, since he enlarged and subverted the rules set up by his fellow elegiac predecessors, such a position would also fit Leucippe and Clitophon in the field of Greek novel. The frequent mocking exploitations of generic conventions, the contestation of traditional and honorable novelistic values, such as chastity, fidelity, or temperance, have led some scholars to define the novelist as a virtuoso saboteur or a guerriero fighting against the novelistic genre itself. It is true that Leucippe and Clitophon displays a matrix of cultural influences and subject positions, and this matrix is expressed by a remarkable narrative choice, unique among the Greek novels. Clitophon is indeed the narrator of his own adventures, and this homodiegetic framework only allows a limited access to Clitophon's point of view, with a few exceptions. Besides, this choice of the ego narrative to express not only the secret and silent yearnings of Clitophon, but also the implicit approbations of Leucippe, sets some puzzling questions, quite comparable to the ones aroused by Ovid in his Amores and Ars Amatoria. Living in the Phoenician city of Tyre, in a wealthy house saturated with visual signs of erotic experiences, Clitophon falls in love with his cousin Leucippe at first sight. But falling in love in Achilles' words means nothing else than sexual attraction and consummation. While in the first century romances of Chariton of Aphrodisias and Xenophon of Ephesus, the merging of Gamos, wedding, and Eros, love, and its preservation are the tellers of the narrative, Clitophon does not really seem concerned by marrying Leucippe before the beginning of Book 4, at the very middle of the story. This is where the goddesses Artemis and Aphrodite visit the two lovers in dreams and prevents them from making love before they get finally married. During the first two books in particular, we are not aware of Leucippe's reaction to Clitophon's appeals, if not through the lens of Clitophon himself. Born free from a respectable family, Leucippe is a perfect Parthenos, watched by her mother and confined to the space arranged for the woman by Hippias, Clitophon's father, in his house. But on the other hand, she is also spiritual, open-minded, and free to walk by Hippias' house or garden and to receive guests into her bedroom, at least during the day. This kind of social fiction and fantasy reminds the Ovidian world, which strictly separates its actors between Wiri and Puelai, whose sole preoccupation is to seduce themselves reciprocally. Like in Ovid's erotic poems, one of the privileged moments available for subtle seductive games in Leucippe and Clitophon happens to be the time of symposium. But it is a symposium largely influenced by the Roman convivium, with its women sharing a glass of wine with their husbands, where the drinking and the eating seem combined into a single event. The formula epei kairos en, when it was time, is a pattern that punctuates the socialized breaks and reunions during the Tyrian episode in the first two books of the novel. Three symposia take place in Hippias' house in the first two books. The second symposium offers to Clitophon the opportunity to relate the birth of the wine, where the god Dionysus reveals to a shepherd that the wine, which brings so much pleasure even before it reaches the mouth, is a liquid of the autumn and the blood, Aima, of the cluster. Wine is connected to life and vitality, as we've seen. Like blood, it gives life to human bodies, and like love, it inflames both the body and the spirit. In the Ars Amatoria, the poet praises the action of the divine beverage and the association of Eros and Dionysius, or Cupid and Bacchus, in the Latin text, and this is a text 8. Banquets too give openings when the tables are set. Someone beside wine may you find here, often as bright-hued love with soft arms drawn to him and held down the arms of Bacchus as he then reclined, and so on and so on. And the conclusion of this text, wine gives courage and makes men apt for patience. Vina parent animos facunque caloribus aptos. Care flees and is drawn in much wine. And indeed, wine gives courage to Clitophon, who scrutinizes its effect on himself as he gazes upon Leucippe. And this is the text 9. Once Eros and Dionysus, two forceful gods, biaioi theoi, have gripped the soul, they drive it to ecstatic shamelessness, the one burning it with his usual flame, the other providing the fuel in the form of wine, for wine is the food of desire. Now she too plucked up the courage to gaze upon me more attentively. Eros and Dionysus are linked with liberation from social protocols, and the phrasing here clearly seems to echo the Ovid's praise. Clitophon also suggests that Leucippe is concerned by the liberating action of wine. But beware, an excess of wine must be avoided, especially in the case of a young girl, and the poet sends an unambiguous warning in the last book of Ars Amatoria, addressed to the Puelai. A drunk girl puts herself at risk of being assaulted. And this is the text 10. A woman lying steeped in wine is an ugly sight. She deserves to enter any union whatever. Nor is it safe when the table is clear to fall asleep. In sleep, much happens that is shameful. During the third and last symposium, the erotic tension builds. Clitophon and Leucippe then receive the welcome assistance of Satyros, Clitophon's servant. And this is the last text on the screen. When it was time to drink, we all once again set about drinking as before. And the emphasis is put here on the repetition of drinking, deeply embedded in erotic seduction. Satyros was our wine waiter, and he made arrangements for Eros, exchanging our cups, giving mine to the girl and hers to me, offering them to both of us when he poured the wine and after mixing in the water. I watched it for the place on the cup where the maiden slip touched it as she drank, and glued my own then there when I drank, sending her a telegraphed kiss, epistolimaion philema, as I kissed the cup. When she noticed, she perceived, syneken, which is the usual word used by Clitophon, when he believes subverbal communication to have taken place successfully, that I was kissing even the shadow of her lips, to Kaelus Tenskian. Satyros gathered the cups in again and exchanged ours. Then I saw that the girl too was now imitating my actions and drinking in the same way. And my joy was all the greater. This happened a third time and a fourth time, and for the rest of the day, we drank kisses to one another in this way. This last synesthetic formula, we drank kisses, involves softness, tasting, and touching, with the help of the well-named Satyros, who appears to be a blend between a Praeceptor Amoris and a Servus Calidus stemming from the new comedy. As far as I know, the preponderance of these symbolic and symbolic motifs is hard to parallel in ancient Greek world, at least. Of course, some argue for a lost common source of Ovid and Greek novelists, for instance, in Greek New Comedy. But that seems unless quite unlikely to me and others like Tim Whitmarsh and Dan Jolovitz. Besides, the Ovid and Achillostatius text promote an anthropological mixing of fluidity and liquidity, which colors these erotic games with multiple and overlapping actions of theme, drinking, and kissing. Both texts underline the inflammable nature of wine that you have to control and balance, as well as its corporeal substance, which authorizes to write words and to welcome the printing of the lips. I come now to my second point. Some Ovidian texts, as you are aware of, have been widely discussed those last years in regards to the irruption of whis or violence the lover may exploit in courting his beloved. In the ars amatoria, the suitor will be able to and will have to overcome, with the violence that must be nonetheless controlled by ars, a feminine resistance that is portrayed as a necessary part of the game. I quote here the infamous passage you probably know of ars amatoria. Who that it wise would not mingle kisses with coaxing words? So she gives them not, yet takes the kisses she does not give. Perhaps she will struggle at first and cry, "You villain," yet she will wish to be beaten in the struggle. Only beware lest snatching them rudely you hurt her tender lips, and she be able to complain of your roughness. He who has taken kisses, if he take not the rest beside, will deserve to lose even what was granted. After kisses, how much was lacking to you was fulfillment, or that was awkwardness, not modesty. You may use force. Women like you to use it. They often wish to give unwillingly what they like to give. She whom a sudden assault has taken by storm is pleased and counts the audacity as a compliment. But she who, when she might have been compelled, departs untouched. Though her looks find joy, will yet be sad. These controversial and much commented verses, which encourage the lovers to take advantage of this kiss and encourage the support of whis, may nonetheless be read and understood at the light of the verses that follow a little further in the text. And this is the text 13. In truth, just as there is shame sometimes in beginning first, so when another begins, it is pleasant to submit. Too confident in his own charm is a lover if he waits until she asks him first. Let the man take the first step, let the man speak entreating words. She will listen kindly to coaxing entreaties. That you may gain her, ask. She only wishes to be asked. Provide the cause and starting point of your desire. Jupiter went a suppliant to the heroines of all. No woman seduced the mighty Jove. Yet, if you find that your prayers cause swollen pride, stop what you have begun, drew back a pace. Many women desire what flees them. They hate what is too forward. Moderate your advance and save them from getting tired of you. The key word here is delay, mora, which implies a delicate and controlled balance between rush and passions. Delay always spurs lovers on, reminds the poet in the book 3 of Ars Amatoria, mora semper amantes incitat. Mick Jagger would probably prefer to say, time is on my side. Giulia has underlined that the supreme adroitness of the artist of love can be measured with a gradual increase in the dose of violence of her time. And she adds that the kiss is in fact a transition phase during which the young man struggles because of her modesty, but at the same time wishes to be overcome. If lover uses force at this stage, he will be rejected and she will stop him from going any further. Molly Yerovitz-Levine is more willing to deny any use of violent constraint in the art of love. She assumes that Ovid raises the possibility of sexual violence in the Ars Amatoria, only to reject it. The Praeceptor warns his student against inflicting any real hurt. Moreover, the Praeceptor's advocacy of female volition in the first two books of the Ars is the obvious raison d'être, in French in the text, for his teaching. Then she concludes, what would be the point of an elaborate treatise on seduction if violent rape were considered a legitimate option? In Achillostatus and Longus, the issue regarding consent is also a problematic one. And I would be reasonably eager to think that both of them might deal with this crucial question through the lens of Ovidian protocols. In Achillostatus, Clinias, Clitophon's cousin, is the first one the young man is addressing after having been struck by his prior vision of Leucippe. Clinias is a likely Ovidian pupil, although he ironically prefers boys and occasionally shows misogynistic attitudes, which presupposes that Ovidian lessons can be taught beyond their exclusive heterosexual context. The following advice is without any doubt a free adaptation of the Ars Amatorias passages we mentioned above, and this is the text 14. Boys and maids are equally shy. Even if they are inclined toward the pleasures of Aphrodite, they do not want to hear what they are undergoing. They think that the shame lies in talking about it, but the maiden is different. She puts up with the border skirmishes of reconnoitering lovers and tend to acquiesce suddenly with a nod. But if you mount a full-scale assault and ask her outright to perform the act, you will stun her ears with your voice. She will blush, condemn your words, and consider them an affront. Even if she is willing to promise you gratification, she will be ashamed to do so. You see, the pleasure she derives from your words leads her to think that she is actually experiencing the act and not simply listening to your attempts. If so, you have more success via the other approach, by breaking her in gently, then maintain for the most part the silence of a mystery cult. A lover's kiss is a silent command when given to the beloved who is willing to surrender, but a sign of capitulation when she is unpersuaded. And if you obtain some guarantee of action, often when they come to the act, even if they are still winning, they want it to look as if they have been forced, thinking to deflect the charge of shameful consent by claiming coercion. So do not waver if you see her resisting, but observe how she resists. You will need to have mastered the principle then too. If she struggles, do not force her. She is unpersuaded as yet. But if she now softens, assume the directorial role in case you ruin the entire game. Sorry for this long quotation, but it seems enlightening and decisive in the mimic adaptation of Ovidian precepts by Achillostatus. The protocols of Eidos clearly forbid the girl from assenting explicitly. Just like in Ovid, the Quella cannot take the initiative, but is thankful to the person who does, and I quote Giulia here. The general assumption is that any female can be won over in time, given the right techniques. Clinias also uses some military metaphors that characterize the siege of a city. Acrobolismoi and Peira suggest military assault. And these metaphors can echo the image of militia amoris, the fighting in love army the lover is enrolled for in elegiac world. And indeed, Clitophon is a soldier at the orders of Eros. Besides, and above all, at the light of Clinias' lessons, it seems that consent does matter. The lover has to be cautious and to carefully decipher the degree of resistance the beloved exhibits. It's not an easy game, and Sophia is needed here, not an easy word to translate. But the clear line is drawn by Clinias between bia, violence, and peito, persuasion. So, at the end, the lover's victory, like in the Ars Amatoria, seems inevitable. We have to remember that Ovid could have sold his lessons with a money-back guarantee. If you rightly follow my advice, there is no presumable failure. Is Clitophon a good pupil of Clinias' lessons? Actually, he seems to know already a good deal by himself, so pretending throughout the first books that he is yet a novice in love. We can mention, amidst other references, the remarkable description of a mutual orgasmic pleasure through kissing between a man and a woman that Clitophon delivers to a supporter of homosexual love. Dan Jolovitz advocates the idea that Achilles would characterize Clinias as a less aggressive version of Ovid. For Clinias, women want the appearance of force. Telusi biadzestai dokein. Whereas Ovidian women would want to be forced. But as we've seen, the Ovidian lover has also to balance the resources offered by the West and to observe, which Clinias' advice also insists on, the degree and the reality of reluctance displayed by the beloved. However, Clitophon remains attached to his military option because Leucippe's complicity is not so clear at his eyes. When Leucippe's servant interrupts a kissing game between the two characters at the great despair of Clitophon, he has also to confess to his reader that Leucippe's thoughts remain indecipherable. I do not know what her emotions were. Clitophon has no access to Leucippe's inner desires. Any absolute transparency is denied, and his abilities in hermeneutics of love are not always convincing and efficient. That is why Satyrus encourages him with a metaphor depicting Leucippe's conquest as a war and Eros and Clitophon as soldiers. And this is the text 15. My good friend, Eros admits of no feebleness. You observe the military nature of accoutrement, the bow, the quiver, the missiles, the flame, all manly things encrammed with courage. And you are cowardly and timorous with a god such as that inside you? In reaction, Clitophon takes up the same metaphor to put himself in the firing line. How long will your silence last, O man without manhood? Why is this cowardice in a soldier in the service of a manly god? Are you biding your time until the girl makes an attack on you? The possibility that Clitophon could use force persists until a passage located at the very middle of the novel we've already mentioned. The two lovers have fled away from Tyre because Leucippe has been surprised by her mother while Clitophon was getting inside her bedroom, and she had to suffer the shame and dishonor of suspicion. The last attempt at Leucippe's virginity happens at the beginning of the fourth book. Clitophon and Leucippe have joined an army ready to fight the Bucoloi, the famous and terrifying Egyptian brigands living along the Nile. Clitophon is then decided to put his manhood to use. Given the military contest, with the spatial proximity of generals' headquarters and the true preparation for a real war, Achilles clearly mocks Clitophon's disposition to show off his Andrea in erotic action much better than on the battlefield, a typical elegiac habitus. At this very moment, Leucippe tells Clitophon the dream she had about Artemis appearing to her and urging her to remain a virgin till Clitophon weds her. Clitophon then recalls that he had a quite similar vision, but of Aphrodite, not of Artemis, who forbids him to enter a temple dedicated to her cult. The doors of this temple of love symbolize, of course, the access to Leucippe's most intimate parts. Clitophon has now to defer to have sex with Leucippe and to refrain himself to coerce her. And this is the text 17. I recount in this dream to Leucippe and subsequently refrain from her attempts to coerce her, biadzestai, to use bia. This renunciation of using bia and the refrain from brutality towards Leucippe coincide with the end of the elegiac games of seduction between the two protagonists. After this episode, Leucippe is turning into a pure abstraction entirely devoted to the preservation of her chastity. And Hélène Morales has developed this transformation in her book on Achilles-Statius. In Ovid and Achilles-Statius, we see a clear shift between the teachability of the arts of seduction with the act of sex, which requires no teaching. Ovid expresses this conviction when he describes, in a humorous parody of Epicure, the first times of humanity in the book 2 of Farce Amatoria. This is the text 18. A man and a woman had tarried together in one spot. What were they to do? They learned themselves. We know to teach them. Artlessly did Venus accomplish the sweet art. Then you have the bird, the female fish, the serpent, the hound, the heifer, the mare, all the animals. They don't need any teaching for having intercourse. Everyone knows what is sex and how to achieve it. Everyone? Not exactly. there is a place where two lovers have not even heard of Eros, are searching in vain for what it is and how to satisfy it. And this place is Longus' novel Daphnis and Chloe. A goatherd and a shepherd, Daphnis and Chloe grow up side by side in the pastoral and bucolic setting of Lesbos. Longus meticulously observes the epiphany of love through a careful and delicate sensual labyrinth, which Giulia has explored at the light of Ovidian art of love and epistemic skepticism, and I think you have seen it already. I will try to undertake a hypothesis and start from the point where she stops her own analysis in Longus. Daphnis and Chloe desperately need some assistance because the imitation of nature and animals is tragically or comically, depends, is tragically or comically unsuccessful in their search for love. They are ignorant at a point beyond any empirical and anthropological considerations. Their sensual experimentations through touching, kissing, and lying down naked together are meaningless to them and unfruitful. They are sexually incompetent, which seems perfectly unnatural considering the Ovidian assumptions we've mentioned above. Daphnis and Chloe meet then a first praeceptor amoris, the old Philetas. He reveals to them that Eros is his own cure, his own pharmacon. Assuredly a beautiful lesson you find also in Theocritus' 11th Idyll, but which is not very helpful for the two beginners. Longus has then to introduce a second guest star, the little she-wolf, Lycaenia. She is such a decisive agent in the erotic awakening of Daphnis that she has even deserved the attention of Jacques Lacan, who wrote in his Seminar, as for the rest, the sexual relation is handed over to the avars of the field of the other. It is handed over to the explanations that are given of it. It is handed over to the old men of whom, it is not a pointless fable, Daphnis must learn what one must do to make love. The old woman is the story of Daphnis and Chloe, Lycaenia, she is not at all a non-woman, she's quite young woman, which shows us that there is an ultimate field, the field of sexual fulfillment, in which, in the last resort, the innocent does not know the way. And if indeed Daphnis does not know the way, the Greek word used by Longus is a metaphorical, odos, the lesson's effects are not as straightforward as expected. Lycaenian masters a kind of technique different from the old shepherd and enjoys a rich characterization compared to most of the secondary characters in Greek novels. Considering her name, Little She-Wolf, her profile can be related to prostitute from Greek epigrams or courtesan from New Comedy. However, her condition of erotic teacher evokes also other women from erotodidactic traditions, like Philaenis or Elephantis, the supposed authors of pornographic and erotic handbooks. She comes from the town, the celebrated place of Ovidian Techne Erotique. She is young, not old, but she's also Orion, in the bloom of youth, which makes her a little older than Daphnis and Chloe. She is, eventually, more delicate than what we find usually in the countryside. She's an expert in the semiotics of love, as we can see in the text 19. On one occasion, she ambushed him, Loke Sassa, when he was alone, and gave him as a gift a set of pipes, and honey in the comb, and a deerskin bag. But she hesitated to say anything because she saw that he was very attached to the girl and surmised that he was in love with Chloe. She had guessed that it was so earlier because of the nodding and the offer. Eknomaton kai gelotos. Lycaenian is able to rightly interpret the erotic signals exchanged by the two ignorant lovers, like the movement of the head of her author, but she is also depicted as a hunter trying to ambush Daphnis. Lycaenian introduces herself to Daphnis as a praeceptor amoris, as testified by the overemphasis put on the erotodidactic lexicon in the text 20. Daphnis, you're in love with Chloe. I learned this from the nymphs in a dream last night. They told me how you cried yesterday, and they told me to save you by teaching you how to make love. ta erotos erga. Love is not kisses and embraces at what rams and egots do. There is leaping, but it is far sweeter than theirs because it takes longer and gives a longer pleasure. If you would like to be freed from your troubles and experience the pleasures you are looking for, then come, give yourself to me as my student. I will teach you your lessons and oblige those nymphs. Daphnis begged Lycaonion to teach him as quickly as possible the skill, the techne, through which he could do what he wanted to Chloe. Lycaonion cannot be exclusive. She is a teleological agent of the novel and intends both to satisfy her desire and to fulfill Daphnis' ignorance. But what is the nature of her lesson to the young man? As Fromm's Zeitlin underlines, the scene of Lycaonion's education of Daphnis into the mechanics of sex is far more blunt and more literal a lesson between pupils and pupil and teacher than the sweet promise of an erotic didactic work might have implied. The human leaping is not comparable to the ones experienced by animals because it takes longer and gives a longer pleasure. A difference that sounds quantitative, perhaps, rather than qualitative. Lycaonion and Daphnis finally make love. The text says that Lycaonion did nothing exotic, uden xenon, which seems to exclude the use of any sophistical technique. We are very far here from Ovid's celebration of mutual orgasm through the various figurae veneris that he recommends to his female readers in the book 3 of Ars Amatoria. With the Lacanian formula, Giulia synthesizes the moral of this initiation. It is intercourse that teaches intercourse in longus. And the result sounds like a parody of Ovid. The lesson ends by an implicit non-lesson, which titillates and frustrates the reader. I would like to conclude this presentation by focusing on what immediately follows Daphnis' defloration. Once his erotic teaching, erotike paidagogia, is completed, Daphnis is eager to run to Chloe and immediately practice what he has learned. But Lycaonion holds him back and warns him with the last advice, and this is the text 21. When Chloe wrestles with you in this kind of wrestling match, she will cry out and weep and will lie there bleeding heavily. Don't be afraid of the blood. When you have persuaded her to give herself to you, lead her to this place, where even she shouts out, no one will hear her, and if she cries, no one will see her, and if she bleeds, she can wash in the spring. Lycaonion is a Gune. Chloe is still a Parthenos. She will then suffer, cry out and weep, and she will bleed heavily. He needs first to persuade her, then to lead her to a remote place where even if she shouts out, no one will hear her, and if she cries, no one will see her, and if she bleeds, she can wash in the spring. Here, albeit the use of persuasion, there is no way to escape the protocols of violence. Chloe first must be persuaded, but how to persuade it? Through which words? While she has to suffer, what John Winkler states as a careful description of defloration as trauma. There is no celebration of pleasure here, no reciprocal sensuality, no mutual orgasm. Wrestling can be a common metaphor for lovemaking, like we've seen in Ovid. But this commonplace usage cannot be understood by Daphnis. For Daphnis, wrestling is wrestling and means suffering, tears, and true blood. Daphnis' reactions to Lycaonion's warning are meaningful, and this is the last text of my handout. First, he pauses to reflect, to consider about the Lycaonion's words. The verb dioklein, the Greek verb dioklein, can mean pester for sex, but can also express a harassment against a city or an enemy, for instance, which could remind the military metaphors used in Ovid and Achilles' statues. The bleeding wounds might refer also to another metaphor, where penetration is compared to killing. But once again, Daphnis takes the metaphor literally, because he is unaware of the linguistic features and the semiotics of erotic discourses. Daphnis is afraid of being seen as a warrior or an enemy by Chloe, even if he carries the weapons of Eros. If making love is making war, then let's limit ourselves to kisses and embraces. The irony spreads out at different levels here. First, like his counterpart Clitophon, an external and powerful agent of love prevents precisely Daphne from pestering Chloe to get more than kisses and embraces. Besides, Daphne lies for the first time to Chloe, being eventually an Ovidian pupil without even knowing it. He told her a lie about snatching the gooses from the eagle's talons, and then holding her close, he kissed her just as he had kissed Lycaonian in their moments of pleasure. He allowed himself that much because it was not dangerous, Akinduna. One important lesson of the Ars Amatoria is indeed to lie to the beloved in order to avoid the birth of dangerous feelings. You have to avoid transparency, otherwise you could see the threatening shadows of a Medea or Clytemnestra arise. But Daphne does not necessarily feel unfaithful to Chloe, and his lie aims less perhaps to preserve Chloe from a natural jealousy than to protect her from the suitable but dangerous knowledge he now enjoys. Paradoxically, we attend the return of delay, sensual but unfruitful pleasures, through kisses and embraces, at a moment when we were expecting the conclusion of this unbearable sexual postponement. We will have to wait until the very end of the novel once Daphne and Chloe get married and make love under the patronage of a civic union, very far from the Ovidian universe of free love. When Ovid creates his own world to play his erotic and sophisticated erotic games, advocates mutual orgasm, blurs the status of woman, and devotes his last book to his female readers, Longus claims that there is no sophistication needed in conjugal intercourse, and that the autopraxis of erotic knowledge can only blossom behind the doors of the thalamus in the strict boundaries of legitimate wedding. We have to remember that in the beginning of book 1 of Daphne and Chloe, the narrator says that the god Eros, he himself invented a serious plot, spude, opposed to the games Daphne and Chloe were playing. For Longus, love is serious stuff. It's not a game, and for Longus, it's a too serious stuff, perhaps, to be left to Roman outsiders like Ovid. To conclude briefly this too long presentation, I would insist on the fact that what is at stake here, to my opinion, is not only conventional intertextuality. What are indeed the consequences of a reversal, albeit limited, of the traditional Greco-Roman exchanges in terms, in our case, of theory of love, sensuality, and desire? It seems to me that Achillostatus and Longus go far beyond some simple references and are engaged in an adaptation and contestation of erotic approach in Ovid's love treatises. In that case, that would suggest that these authors find in Ovid from theoretical grounds and propositions they do not find in the usual Greek materials concerning Eros. They have at disposal, whether it be Homer, Plato, Sappho, or whoever. And of course, the fact that Achillostatus and Longus, and Greek novel in general, feel obliged to deal with these likely Latin sources while remaining absolutely quiet about them, raises other questions, legitimate questions, I would be more than happy to share with you. Thank you for your attention.
Really, thank you very much, Romain. This is becoming such a detailed and situational way of exploring the question that we really can project ourselves in these moments, in these scenarios, and in this very, very nuanced and sometimes ephemeral instance of sensuality. It's really coming together. Thank you so much. Actually, I have a question about the end of your talk. Do you think that there is no pleasure at the horizon of this married couple, Daphne and Chloe? I mean, there is no hope. There is no hope. Yes. in Logos, because I found very striking your final argument. And I can see the logic of this opposition between the playfulness of the erotic encounter with a woman who is not a Parthenos, who is a Guinée, and with whom precisely pleasure is possible, on the one hand, and on the contrary, the conjugal perspective. So are you thinking that we must understand that the playfulness for Chloe and Daphne was going on in this interminable flirt with all the doubts, precisely all the questioning, all the not knowing, all the fumbling. And then with marriage, it starts with bleeding and it will go on with, I don't know, pregnancy and the pain of giving birth for her. And there is no pleasure once again? Or do you think that we have to understand that precisely bleeding is the consequence of a particular sexual act, which is the first one for her? So how do you see the temporality of the happy and unhappy ending here?
Yeah, it's a delicate question. I should have introduced perhaps the conclusion of Daphnis and Chloe in my handout, but it was long enough. But the conclusion is quite puzzling because the text says exactly that for the first time, once the thalamus, the doors are closed from the thalamus, we cannot see what's happening behind the doors. We only know that, and it's the very last words of the text, Daphnis did some of the things that Lycaonion taught him, and it was then that Chloe learned for the first time that the things they had done earlier in the woods were merely games, paignia, that shepherds play. So it doesn't mean that there is no pleasure, okay, but it means explicitly that it's no more game. It's serious now. It's serious thing you're doing, which is quite different from Ovid, because in Ovid, you've got a coincidence between pleasure and play. I mean, play is pleasure actually, even in the sexual act. The pleasure of the sense, the celebration of the senses, and so on. It's quite different in Longus, because it doesn't mean that the pleasure is absent from the final scene and the consummation of the wedding, but we learn that for Longus, what was before was only game. It was no really love. It was not love. So love is a serious stuff. It's not game, and especially shepherd games, which means kissing and embrace and so on.
So you think that beyond, sorry, Ellen, so you think that beyond that first bleeding, there is hope for pleasure even within the conjugal relation?
Perhaps, but we doesn't know really. We doesn't know really.
We don't know.
Depending on the words of the conclusion.
We don't know. Okay. Ellen?
Thank you, Giulia. It's lovely to see you, Romain. I wanted your paper to start where it ended, really, and I'd like you to say more about how these novelists found in Ovid a resource that they didn't find in the usual Greek sources. And let me put the question like this: if one of the things that Achilles Tatius is doing is narrativizing the advice that you get in Ovid, does that narrative reinscribe the misogyny of Ovid? Or does it, because we get to see more about, we get to see things that can make us laugh at Cleitophon, and we don't know what's happened at the end. This is sort of following on from what Giulia said in a slightly different way. But if we see that the marriage hasn't worked out, or if we see that there's something amiss at the end with Cleitophon, does it in some ways, you know, undermine? Is it an undermining supplement to Ovid?
It's a very interesting question. Thank you. It's very hard to answer, and I don't really know what to answer to this question. Actually, you've got a clear separation, a clear shift between the first books. Once they flee from Tyre, there is no more. I mean, to my opinion, but there is no more explicit traces of Ovid, of Ovidian text in the following books after the book 2, or book 3, say. I'm sure that Achilles' Statius is questioning, as you've said, the misogynistic approach of Ovid, especially perhaps because it shows an adept or a supporter of homosexual love to be the praeceptor amoris, which is quite surprising. And you've got the second praeceptor amoris is Menelaus, who is also an adept or a supporter of homosexual love. So it's quite puzzling that these lessons, normally addressed to heterosexual weir and heterosexual woman in the book 3 of Ars Amatoria, it's quite amusing. I think it's beyond a simple joke. I think he's questioning here, you're right, perhaps a misogynistic approach and perception of Ovid. I mean, if we can say that Ovid is misogyne in this as a matter of fact, but it's quite clear that he is questioning that, and I'm not quite sure to have understood what you were related to the end of the novel. I mean, the relation to the relationship to the end of the novel.
Well, it's another way in which we might see Clytophon, depending on whether we see them as living happily ever after, or depending on what we read between the gap between the ending of the novel and, you know, and the sort of the prologue, where Clytophon as a narrator appears to have been abandoned, or, you know, depending on how we think about that, that's going to frame how we think about Clytophon as a successful praeceptor.
Yes, and it's interesting because I think there is a clear comparison between the world, I mean, the fantasy world of Ovid in the first books, where there is no clear social status like in Ovid. I mean, you've got this woman, Leucippe, this young woman, Leucippe, who is walking along the garden and the house, and there is no problem. There is no really. It's a game. It's a theatrical game, and so on. And actually, we never learn that Clytophon is married to Leucippe. Is getting married to Leucippe. Actually, we do not know if he's actually married to Leucippe. So the social status is still blurred at the end of the novel. So we still remain in this kind of puzzling situation and fantasy situation, because it's not, I mean, clearly concluded. It's not concluding by wedding or by social officialization of the situation. So actually, there is not really a shift between the beginning and the end of the novel, I think. But
thank you. Are there other questions?
I'm just curious if you think what you think about sort of non-consensual acts of violence against women, following this idea that there is an element of desirability in consent. And when you were sort of talking about these Ovidian moments where women act as though they don't want it, but they actually do want it. So what does that sort of say about these explicitly non-consensual acts in Ovid, and sort of how does that change the sort of type of desire or the motivations of that perpetrator?
Actually, I can answer perhaps at the light of Greek novels, because I think here that Greek novels explicitly responds to the question of consent in Ovid, and the way Ovid describes the fact that the woman pretends, wants to be forced while they pretend not to be, and so on. And I think that Achilles' Statius precisely is questioning this issue in his novel, because the fact that it's a homodiegetic framework precisely indicates that Achillostatius is thinking about the limitation of the point of view to the wants of Clitophon. So he wants to explore, he wants to know Leucippé's emotions and willing and so on, but he cannot actually. He can never really know what she's thinking about his appealings and about everything and about his seduction and so on. He's all the time frustrating about that. And he repeats all the time, I don't know what she was really thinking, and I don't know, and I don't know, and I don't know. And he needs a praeceptor amoris to explain him that, you know, that even if you don't know, if you follow the advice, you will see through signs, through things, that she actually is willing to accept you and to accept your seduction. But I think that really here, Achillostatius is offering a kind of commentary to Ovidian issue of consent, which is still puzzling and sometimes revolting for us, because as you know, these passages in Ovid have raised a lot of questions and a lot of controversial discussions. And I think that Achillostatius is clearly engaging in this limitation. I mean, when you're a man and you want to seduce a woman, you never really know what she thinks really about love, what she thinks really about your seduction and so on. So you have to deal with that and how to deal with that. And I think that's the point.
That's the point. If I can abuse just to rebound on this, I mean, all this reading, both of Ovid and the novel, if I may say so, Romain, you will correct me, supposes a huge suspension of belief on the alleged, and I emphasize alleged misogyny of Ovid as a monolithic judgment on Ovid. And it, you know, the simple fact of bringing in the question of time, love is time, desire is time for Ovid. So it's extremely important to see not just what desire is in a given instant, and what's the response of the other person's desire to the lover's desire is in a given instance, but what is supposed to happen over time. And I think that what Romain has brought into this hermeneutical, going back to this text, is a focus on signs, because if we take a semiotic perspective, then, you open the door to the idea that you need time to read the signs, and that the signs can be suggestion for the future. They allow you to guess what will happen, how the other person's desire will evolve over time. This is why Mora and Amor go together. So it's a completely different reading of Ovid to start with, dear Helen, and then, this sort of conversation that can be seen with the novel starts from there, with this fundamental suspension of belief. And with this, I think that Ellen Finkelpearl, thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you. It's sort of shifting gears a little bit. Thank you so much for raising the idea that Greek authors could actually be reading Latin literature. I mean, to me, that's the big sort of takeaway here. Although obviously erotics and sensuality is central as well. But I often wondered in the past about the story of Apollonius, king of Tyre, so that there are all those quotations of the Aeneid in there, and in Aeneid 4, and so erotic as well. But if that was originally written in Greek, then was that author quoting Latin as well? And so that always seemed to me a place, we can't prove whether that was originally written in Greek, but it seems like there's a sort of tendency to think that these days. So I think I had a question in here somewhere. Yeah, I guess my question was, are there really not indications anywhere about imperial Greek authors, sort of something in Alice Gellius or something like that, right? About Greek imperial authors reading Latin literature.
No, actually, we don't have really any indication. If I'm focusing on Greek novels, it's because it's precisely in this text that it seems that the influences of Latin literature seems the strongest and seem perhaps the clearest in our corpus, because we don't really have. Of course, I don't know all the literature of the imperial area, but probably the other authors like Aelius Aristides and so on, of course, Plutarchus, should have known Latin authors. But to be engaged in a dialogue of this kind, just like the Greek novelists do with the Ovidian treatises, I think it's unparalleled in the world Greek literature of the imperial area. I think we don't have any as strong engagement or commitments to discuss or to contest this perception. And I'm pretty convinced that it's due to the erotic frame, to the erotic background of this work, because these Greek authors, they find a discourse about love and about Eros and about consent and about everything they don't find in the Greek literature. Of course, they've got all the philosophical stuff. They've got it with Plato, and they do, and they Platonize. I mean, Longus and Achillostatius Platonizes a lot in their novels. But about this kind of stuff, about sensuality, about time, about delay, about everything Giulia mentioned, I think they don't have any comparable stuff in the Greek materials at disposal. So that's why they're looking for something perhaps uncommon, and perhaps it's not surprising that it is a Greek novel, because Greek novel is a kind of outsider. It's on the margin of the Greek literature. So perhaps it's not so surprising that it's among these outsiders that we find perhaps a so strong connection with Latin sources, and perhaps it's an hypothesis, but
yes, it is also, I think, important to perhaps to open up the perspective of erotodidactic in the sense that we could say that the tradition of an erotica techne goes back to Socrates. You find it in all sort of poetic voices. You find it in Elegy. There is a constant playfulness on the paradox of precisely having to learn to desire. It's not just having to learn some, vulgar tricks on about how to handle a relationship or how to cheat your husband, as it can be sometimes. But it's really, in a sense, the mega challenge of dealing with something that could be seen as a matter of automatic response of a body or as immediate overwhelming passion, and that in reality require all this learning. So perhaps the sort of larger picture here is precisely how on a long duration there has been a return toward the question of something to learn. So a sort of physis techne kind of dilemma. And then anyone who has something to say in this tradition can be an interlocutor. And of course, the Ars Amatoria is the big, explicit monumental text. So, there is a lot to laugh at and to smile about in also this reception that I think comes across in the montage that you have presented us with today. I see Sarah's hand. Sarah.
I was just following on what you were saying. I guess what was perhaps obviously what jumped out at me was the quotation from Lacan that you chose, and that that you chose it just in, well, it seemed that you chose it as you were talking about Longus, but it would seem that that quotation belongs at the beginning of everything, right? That it's not really, that's kind of the frame of what you're talking about, right? So I was wondering why, if you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, actually it was a pun, but it was interesting that that Lacan, chose this precisely this example. I don't know how we came to Daphne and Chloe, but it's interesting because for him the quotation makes clear that for Lacan what is important, it's at stake here is the beginning of everything, as you've said. As he say, the sexual relation is handed over to the hazards of the field of the other. And of course, you need someone. You need someone in erotics, and you need someone first. And that's the point. Of the Lacan quotation, because for Longus, there is, I think, a thinking about the beginning, the very beginning of everything. The very beginning of everything, because before there was nothing. With Daphne and Chloe, there is nothing. They are less than experience. They know nothing. They don't even know the name of love. So we are very experiencing the very beginning of everything. And that's why perhaps it was interesting for Lacan, because it was a place where nothing happens just before, and where you have nothing before the sexual act. And even when it happens, which is interesting, I don't know if Lacan has really read Daphne and Chloe, I'm not quite sure about that, but actually it's interesting what it happens after the sexual act. Because after the sexual act, Daphne comes back to kisses and embraces, and it's like nothing. It's like everything, nothing has happened actually. So it's interesting at the light of Lacan's quotation, because Lacan was using this example, as you've said, to say that you need someone to take you to the thing, to the sex, and actually before there is nothing. And in Daphne and Chloe, actually there is nothing. There is nothing before the lesson Lacanian is giving to Daphne, but which is of course amusing, is that after there is nothing, left, because there is nothing left but the fear of hurting the other, which is quite interesting. I'm not quite sure what Lacan would have said about that, but actually it was a very short quotation about Daphne and Chloe, and it's all that he said about it.
But you really think there's nothing? Because there seems to be some kind of change in the relationship between Daphne and Chloe after he learns, right? It's not, they don't have sex, but until the end, but he has been, in a Lacanian sense, he's been socialized into some kind of, or he's been introduced into some kind of symbolic.
Yes, of course, he has a kind of symbolic knowledge, and he has a knowledge, a dangerous knowledge, because I think that it's interesting that the Greek adjective, which Daphne wants to carry on with his embraces and his kissing, because it's akindinos, it's not dangerous. So he wants to avoid the danger, because knowledge is danger here. So yes, of course it's different because he learns something different, but actually up to the end of the novel and of the wedding night, there's nothing really happens. And actually, even in the text, nothing distinguishes Daphne from Chloe because he has learned something. once he refuses to hurt Chloe. We actually know nothing of their relationship. I mean, in the fourth book, in the last book of Longus, the story turns around the identity, the civic identity of Daphnis and Chloe, which is the point of the last book of Daphnis and Chloe. There's nothing more about love and about Eros and about everything in the last book, which is quite interesting. After this initiation, we don't really, there is nothing, actually. There is no references to any love or any new attempt of doing something.
So we finished on Lacan. What better way of, suspending our conversation for the future, and what better way of for someone who thinks a bit with Lacan to have this idea of the erotic as something which is so not an instinct, so not an immediate drive, and requires so much thinking and so much speaking about it just to get asymptotically close to pleasure. So thank you all very, very much. Bye-bye.